Looking further afield, outside of the direct events on the battlefield, obviously militaries have to be resupplied to be supported externally. And from both sides, we've seen some interesting shifts, be that the development of the idea of Eastern Sentinel or NATO boosting its eastern flank after Russia's provocations in the north or with the drones. But on the other side, Trump's secondary sanctions seemingly making China get cold feet and Russia's reliance on Russia and India for buying their oil or acquiring equipment from North Korea. What would you emphasize to viewers and listeners on this angle?
The external factors are really important in terms of the dynamics of the war. So you're absolutely right to raise the secondary sanctions and the tariffs. That, of course, has been is a result of the slight pivot of the Trump administration's policy this year towards a more hardened stance towards the Kremlin, broadly driven, I think, by growing frustration at the lack of any movement in the Kremlin's demands and ultimate war objectives in Ukraine, which again, as I said.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at international relations, geopolitics and economics, but with a particular focus on Russia-Ukraine, given the severity and magnitude of it. Right now, we are seeing a lot of activity around Pokrovsk, and something that I don't tend to do is focus on the minute details, the day-to-day battle dynamics, not because they're not important, but because ultimately I don't think that they're going to have the ultimate decision in the outcome of the war. You may well disagree, and I welcome your comments below, but someone who follows this on a much more regular basis in terms of these minute details, but also the bigger picture, which we'll be coming to later on in the programme, is Alexander Lord, or Alex Lord, who is the Europe-Eurasia lead analyst at Sibylline, a intelligence consultancy group here in London, and someone who we've been trying to get on for a while. Alex, it's a pleasure to have you. I think the first question, to just jump in straight into it, is sort of, what are we missing here? On one hand, the media on the West is very much, Pokrovsk is critical. If Russia takes it, it's a big blow. But on the other hand, sort of this narrative that Pokrovsk is meaningless or very limited in its strategic value. What's the truth?
It's a great question, and thanks very much, Pyotr, for having me on. So we can look at Pokrovsk in various ways. We can look at the military side of things in terms of, what the Russians are gaining, what the Ukrainians are losing if it falls, the relative costs to both sides for its defence and its seizure. We also then can look at the strategic picture, how this battle fits into the wider dynamics of the war, the objectives of the Kremlin, and indeed the strategic necessities on the Ukrainian side to try and weather this storm. And I think it depends on how you look at it, really sort of informs your conclusion in terms of the importance or lack thereof of the battle for Pokrovsk. But I do think it is important for various reasons in both. Obviously, the battle for the city itself has been grinding on for quite a while now, well over a year, really. I mean, there's various timelines you can put on it in terms of the beginning of the battle for Pokrovsk, but essentially it's been over a year. And where the Russians have been steadily advancing towards and then around the city. Where we're at the moment, the Russians have essentially built a semi-encirclement towards a sort of cauldron where they are essentially controlling large areas of the flanks of the city and increasingly now operating within the city and have been utilising some relatively successful infiltration tactics, which I think we can talk about in a bit more detail in terms of how that differs from previous protracted urban assaults, which we've seen the Russians undertake during the course of this war. But at the moment, Ukrainians are under a significant amount of pressure at the flanks, but increasingly within the city itself. And at that point, the Russians, I think, are essentially trying to build that encirclement to basically force the Ukrainians to withdraw. It doesn't really want to engage in a protracted, it's already been protracted, but an even longer street-by-street battle. If it can avoid it, it wants to essentially force the Ukrainians to make that very, very difficult decision. And it has to be said, under President Zelensky and under Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, who took over in early 2024, both of those key decision makers have been extremely loath to agree to any withdrawals from various towns and cities across eastern Ukraine, even if there are relatively strong military arguments for a withdrawal in terms of, trading space for time, that sort of thing. There have been some examples of the Ukrainians withdrawing. For example, the last major withdrawal was around Velika Novosilka, which the withdrawal from that has facilitated some pretty notable Russian advances to the south of Pokrovsk into the neighboring Zaporizhia Oblast. So over the last month or so, we've seen some notable Russian advances there, while the focus, of course, is around Pokrovsk. And I think this is where we are starting to see, and we can start to pick out how this battle is influencing the overall dynamic of the front, hundreds of kilometers away potentially. And for every soldier the Ukrainians commit to Pokrovsk's defense, of course, is one soldier fewer that they are able to plug additional gaps that the Russians are able to exploit elsewhere. So there are various things here that I think we can go into in a bit more detail. But from the military perspective, the city was a significant logistical hub for the Ukrainians. It's the point of a major railway junction, which had been very, very important indeed to the overall Ukrainian defense of the Donbass region. That utility of the town as a logistics hub is basically gone now. The city is increasingly in ruins. And of course, given the drone penetration and the transparency of the battlefield, the Ukrainians are not really able to operate within the city in any meaningful way.
But Alex, if it's in ruins, what value does it have to... I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on mockery of the Russians because they're taking a husk of a city now, a civilization of 60,000+ people. But what's the point of the Ukrainians still trying to retain it if it has lost any value at this point?
So, as I said, the logistical value for Ukraine is basically gone. The potential logistical value for the Russians, 6 to 12 months in the future, where if they manage to take Pokrovsk, push the line further and rebuild some of that railway infrastructure, that could well have some significant importance to the Russian military. The Russian military is still heavily reliant upon railways and railheads to support its operations. So the fact that there is a significant amount of railway infrastructure in Pokrovsk, even though it is heavily damaged, could well provide further support for Russian offensive operations into northern Donetsk Oblast and even further afield, should it wish, should its ambitions extend that far. So there is a potential military and logistical utility to the Russians. Not immediately. They will be having to rebuild, and that will take time. And of course, the Ukrainians could well launch counterattacks. They could launch increasingly long-range drone attacks, for example, to undermine those efforts. But where we look at other cities that the Russians have taken, they have been able to rebuild some of that logistical infrastructure to support the further advances. The advances are slow, they are grinding, they are extraordinarily costly, but they are being taken nonetheless, and the Russians have shown a relative willingness and ability to sustain that current tempo. So, yes, the city is broadly in ruins at the moment, but the same was the case for various other cities which the Russians have pivoted to support its further operations. Of course, there's a wider question here in terms of the strategic balance, in terms of what the Russians overall are gaining. What they are broadly gaining are shells of cities which will require trillions upon trillions of rubles of investment to make them economically stable, never mind economically viable. So there are longer term questions here, but this war is not about territorial conquest in and of itself. That's only part of what we're dealing with here. The Russians, specifically the Kremlin, has broader ambitions, which I think, play into much broader strategic and geostrategic priorities regarding NATO expansion, regarding empire building. The Kremlin has indicated its neo-imperialist ambitions within Ukraine. It considers it to be a vital territory within the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, and that hasn't shown any signs of budging, and the Russians have actually doubled down on that narrative over the last few months alone. Pokrovsk is in and of itself a relatively small town. It's an important mining district as well. It was once the beating heart of much of the Donbass's most productive mining facilities. Again, broadly, that's no longer the case, but of course, there's still a lot of resources under the ground, which could well be, to Russia's advantage in the medium to longer term. But otherwise, the key military utility in the short to medium term, in terms of, the remaining part of this war, however long it goes on for, will likely be that if and when the Russians take Pokrovsk, that will likely facilitate Russia's next phase of campaigning in early 2026, which is likely focused on moving north of Pokrovsk to essentially begin to cut off what's called the fortress belt of Ukrainian cities, which form the urban backbone of Donetsk Oblast, and essentially represent the remaining prize in the Donbass for the Russians to seize. They've already begun that process by encroaching on the eastern flank, encroaching on the south. If Pokrovsk falls, that would potentially provide the Russians with an opportunity. They may not succeed, but certainly an opportunity to build the pressure from the western flank as well, and essentially begin a much larger encirclement of those towns and cities. Those cities, including Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, Kostiantynivka, are amongst the most heavily defended and heavily defensible cities left to Ukraine. So that any advantage that the Russians can gain in terms of applying additional pressure at the flanks could prove of strategic significance.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the fortress belt, fortress city, so to speak, because in my mind and other people's, it seems to be that the Russians being quite methodical about they're going after Pokrovsk and then they're going after these other specific cities, partially with the symbolism of trying to secure down the rest of Donetsk Oblast, but also because, as you say, that these defensive cities, these points are some of the most important for Ukraine in its eastern area at least, or perhaps nationwide as well. So could you expand a little bit more on the sort of what you, maybe if you want to call it forecasting, what you could see as the sort of longer term visions of the Russians? The Russians are learning, they are adaptable, they do evolve. We've seen this through their reaction to the Ukrainians' use of drones as well. So just a few different elements there I'd love you to pick apart.
Absolutely. In terms of the Russian objectives in Ukraine, militarily, I think that it's pretty clear that the conquest of the remainder of the Donbass, Donetsk Oblast, basically the areas that we discussed earlier, the Fortress Belt, Pokrovsk, and the areas to the northwest, that is essentially the minimum territorial objectives for the Russians, I think. In my assessment, it remains pretty unlikely that the Russians would, specifically the Kremlin would agree to end the war before those objectives are completed, given the need to go to the population and say it was all worth it, right? So without that becomes a hard sell. And I think at that point, that's why they're likely to be the minimum objectives. I actually think the Kremlin's aspirations in Ukraine go beyond that. And I mean, I have to talk about the more strategic piece as well. But in terms of the Donbass, that's, I think, where we're at. Now, of course, given the extraordinarily slow pace of Russia's advances, the conquest of what remain to be the largest cities in eastern, in Donetsk, is not going to be a fast operation. Taking, as you mentioned, Pokrovsk, a city before the war, 60,000 people. It's taken well over a year to achieve that, if indeed they do, in the coming weeks. We're talking about much larger urban areas in the fortress belt, and the prospect of slowly grinding forward towards those would under the current trajectory of the pace of advances take multiple years. Of course, the Russians don't want to do that. They are interested in trying to push the Ukrainians at every opportunity, and essentially doubling down on essentially what I think is an attritional strategy. All wars are attritional, but I think the Kremlin has, in particular, favoured and accepted the need for an attritional strategy to the war, following essentially the failure of its initial invasion in 2022. The Russians at that point had significant maneuver capabilities, which allowed the Russians to move large numbers of forces very, very quickly indeed, conducting operations across thousands of square kilometers, all the way up to Kyiv and across the south. Of course, that failed. The Russians had to withdraw from Kyiv, they had to withdraw from Kharkiv, they had to withdraw from Kherson to consolidate the line. And at that point, we saw the war transition from a maneuver war, high-intensity war, to broadly a positional high-intensity war, where essentially the bulk of the fighting is taking place in essentially a sort of static positions or broadly stable positions, which has facilitated slow grinding advances. A bit more similar to the sort of dynamics we saw in the First World War, although I know people like to compare the war with the First World War in particular. There is some utility to that comparison, but of course the war is a completely different beast. But in terms of the territorial advances, that's broadly the rate which we're seeing. Now, territorial advances, I think, only tell us so much about the dynamics of this war. If we are to look at a map, for example, the advances from 2022 and where the Russians are now, we could easily conclude that the Russians have absolutely lost this war, given the withdrawals, the Ukrainian counterattacks, and the extraordinarily slow progress the Russians have made since. But that only tells us so much. The Russians are, I think, doubling down on a war predicated upon their attritional advantages over Ukraine, namely in manpower and personnel, in industrial capacity, in strategic depth, and we're starting to see the impact of Ukrainian long-range attacks against Russia, for example. But the Russians have significant strategic depth to be able to mitigate the impact of strikes against oil refineries, for example, in a way that the Ukrainians just simply do not. They are also, of course, I think, fairly confident in their own ability to coerce their population to continue their quote-unquote support for the war. Support for the war is broadly, is pretty widespread. But I think increasingly, particularly in 2026, we're likely to see an increase in the economic cost for the average Russian in a way that hasn't really happened up until now. And that's, I think, an interesting one to watch, which will cause the Kremlin some concern. But I think they are relatively confident for the short to medium term, at the very least, that they can continue this war, because ultimately I think they believe that their political will to continue grinding forward is stronger than not only the Ukrainians, but crucially, their Western backers in Washington, D.C., in Europe. And I think that is where the crux of the Russian strategy, which may or may not be proven to be correct or wrong. But I think that's their thinking, that they can leverage their strategic, demographic, industrial advantages to weather the storm for that little bit longer, more than Ukraine and its Western allies. So at that point, one has to consider the overall rates of losses as well. So not only the territorial advances, we're seeing, a few towns here and there being taken, but actually the wider picture is the Russians are able to endure significantly higher casualty rates than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are suffering from acute personnel shortages which will only become more and more acute as time goes on. The Russians, of course, have their own manpower problems, but again, that strategic depth is such that the Russians have various options. The Russians haven't even mobilized their active reserve, although we can talk about this. I think they're actually in the process of beginning that process now with some legislative changes, which we've seen over the last month alone. So we may well be seeing a slight pivot there. But again, that underscores, I think, Russia's determination and ability to sustain an attritional war for, at least the next year, if not several years. Whereas Ukraine, I think, is going to face increasingly more difficult decisions, including a reducing conscription age, which is still at 25. That's still relatively controversial. But again, when we're looking at the overall balance, I think this is something that the Russians are banking on, essentially, to win them the war.
There's something that you seem to note when you travel around Europe, not you personally, but when one notes when they travel, which is that there are a lot of Ukrainians who have fled or who have been abroad before the war largely took full scale, shall we say, nature. And that is younger Ukrainians, men included. So, what's there to stop the Ukrainians really trying to clamp down on those who try to avoid conscription or fighting? Because the Russians have a lot more centralized command. They have a much more stronger, if you want to say, indoctrination of the population. So what would it take for Ukraine to really address effectively that manpower issue? Or is it more about technology and drones at this point to counterbalance?
Manpower is still absolutely fundamental. The Ukrainians have pivoted to a drone-based strategy very, very rapidly and very, very successfully, it has to be said, largely due to limitations not only in terms of personnel, but also conventional military capabilities. The bread and butter of what we consider to be the bread and butter of modern warfare, vehicles, ammunition, etc., artillery. The Ukrainians have always had a shortage of all of those things. The Russians have had a proportionate sort of an advantage in that regard. So I think that's what led the Ukrainians to really go down the drone innovation route. And they have done so extremely successfully, it has to be said. And the Russians are copying the Ukrainians, for example. The Ukrainians are absolutely the most innovative drone producers, use of tactics. They are innovating in a way that nobody else on earth is. So that is important. And I'm happy to talk about the drone piece in more detail as well. But just in terms of the manpower and personnel, drones do not reduce the need for men. At the front, we are seeing acute personnel problems, which has meant that the Ukrainians are not able to effectively man the vast defensive fortifications that they have produced and constructed. They've constructed a significant array of fortifications. And I was in Kyiv earlier this year, and I went close to the Belarusian border to the north, and you can see the tank traps, you can see the pretty impressive fortifications. Now that's one thing. The fortifications close to the front line, of course, infantry holding, infantry positions, etc., hard points, etc. From what we're seeing, the Ukrainians simply do not have the men to be able to effectively man all of those fortifications. So there are serious questions there. Also, in terms of drones, a lot of drone capabilities still require men to operate them. They require, significant numbers of personnel at the front, as well as in the rear, operating particularly long-range, large bomber drones. Now, bomber drones are increasingly something that the Ukrainians are putting resources towards, essentially because of their longer range, their heavier carrying capacity, and the fact that they are reusable. They go on a mission and they are very much intended to return home. That allows units in Kyiv, for example, to launch multiple sorties every night, for example. Whereas the first-person view, the much smaller drones, which have a much shorter range, are obviously being utilized by soldiers at the front line and directly behind it. Again, they are only capable of conducting, one or two sorties, and broadly speaking, those drones are not anticipated to come back, particularly if they're attack drones. So there are various issues around drones and their ability to plug personnel gaps. We're seeing Ukraine increasingly experiment with ground drones, unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs. And we've been seeing some relative success in terms of, machine guns being mounted to these drones to hold positions. I'm still relatively skeptical of the large-scale utility of these systems to be able to basically solve Ukraine's problems. I don't think they will. They can, of course, offset personnel shortages, but the fact is, these UGVs, they're still relatively new, and they require a team of men to operate even one. So again, it does not solve the problem. Although the Ukrainians are, of course, innovating here to try and see, increasingly if there's autonomous systems that can provide these sorts of solutions, but I think we're still away from that. Now, just returning to your point about the exodus of sort of military-aged men, the Ukrainian government has been extremely reluctant to expand conscription in terms of the younger generation. So at the moment, the conscription age is 25. Now, that may well strike many as surprising, considering when we look at previous wars that the West has fought, for example, it's actually the 18 to 25 bracket, which is often the first port of call for a government to expand its forces. It's exactly the opposite in Ukraine, and that's led to a very, very high average age at the front. Now, actually, what we are seeing, despite the increasing pressure, increasingly from Western military advisors to Ukraine, the Ukrainian government is actually, if anything, rolling that back still further. And just a couple of months ago, relaxed the restrictions being placed on men between the age of 18 to 22 to leave the country. 4 years into a war, that has raised a lot of eyebrows, I think, amongst Ukraine's military backers in the West, given that in a few years' time, those, of course, will be the new recruits potentially. So we have seen an increase actually in the number of young Ukrainian men leaving the country over the last 2 months alone, for example. And this is again going to reinforce the demographic and personnel issues for Ukraine. So there isn't a short-term solution to this problem. It is fundamentally a political problem, particularly given that it's extraordinarily unpopular within Ukraine to reduce the conscription age. and there are larger, long-term strategic issues around Ukraine's viability as a state if their youngest men die at the front. It is already it's got an aging population, extraordinarily low birth rate, and given all the casualties it's already sustained, there is anxiety in Kyiv that if hundreds of thousands of young men die or are heavily maimed, etc., that will have long-term impacts on Ukraine's demographic stability.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying that both countries and the entire FSU have had demographics as a core systemic challenge since forever, really. But I think what some people forget is that Russia actually has a TFR, or total fertility rate, that is actually higher than Ukraine's, which is partially because of the war, but partially because of Russia's ethnic diversity, which sort of, influences those numbers. But we talk a little bit also about the rhetoric here, be it on both sides, and that sort of Ukraine is going to sweep the Russians, or the Russians are going to snowplow the Ukrainians, which I think is often, I can understand the extremist rhetoric that comes out from both sides, but the reality is much more complex and nuanced as you've laid out, Alex. So I guess sort of my curiosity is, how do you accurately, when you're analysing this, break down what is going on? Because obviously we want Ukraine to win, we want Ukraine to be a sovereign, independent nation, but at the same time, like the corruption revelations that have come out in the past few days, these are problems. And the Ukrainian government, most inner circle, if you want, of Zelensky, needs to get control of it. And that bleeds obviously into the military performance, or morale. So I'm just curious for your thoughts on those sorts of themes.
It's a myriad and complex situation, and trying to cover all of the drivers, all of the inputs in terms of in this war is obviously extraordinarily complex. And in my day-to-day job, it's sort of my job to try and gather as much information as I can to make our assessments. Not all of them, of course, are easily accessible. There's a lot of sort of known unknowns, as it were, in terms of the military situation, but also the political situation. And of course, always those unknown unknowns are the omnipresent, elephant in the room in terms of, any analysis for something this complex. So we can always be surprised, and, doing years of doing this, I'm always surprised at various developments. Wars have a particular logic of their own, and we can never be entirely certain of anything in a military context. But there are various trends which we can look at, and that's tend to be the way I approach it. Sort of looking at overall strategic trends and the direction of travel, because things do have a tendency to change, and information that wasn't previously available, becomes obvious in hindsight. But of course, we're only ever able to access the information that is available at any one time. In terms of Ukrainian government's sort of position at the moment, they are of course in an extremely tricky spot, to say the least. They are going into an extraordinarily difficult winter, where the Russian long-range strike campaign is extracting an increasingly significant toll, and I think it's my assessment that this will be the most difficult winter for Ukraine since the first winter in 2022-2023. Due to a myriad of reasons, including Russian innovation, expansion of long-range system production, and indeed innovation in tactics. Like you said, the Russians do learn. They are adjusting. So complacency, I think, in regards to previous Russian failures, we should always be cautious about that, because this is a highly dynamic war. Situations change. People learn from mistakes. They don't always, and we've seen repeated mistakes on both sides of the front, it has to be said. A lot of focus is obviously on Russian failures, but in my job I have to look at everything on both sides to try and inform my assessment in terms of where this war is most likely to go, and decisions and mistakes are made on both sides, such as war. We all do it. Western intervention in various wars, myriad mistakes have been made. So that's something that's always going to be there. But I think looking ahead, the war is unfortunately likely to grind on for the foreseeable future, in my assessment. I think in 2026 we may well see an uptick in efforts to facilitate some sort of peace or ceasefire, but I am relatively sceptical that will actually result in a significant, stable end to the war, particularly in early 2026. Obviously, it's increasingly hard to look beyond beyond that, but I'm still relatively skeptical that this war is going to end anytime soon if the Russians don't think that they won't get what they want. As long as the Russians are advancing, however slowly, I think ultimately that will inform us that the Russians will continue. If they stop, if their advances are stopped, that may well, over a period of months, start to inform the Kremlin and start to influence its decision making in terms of how sustainable is this war? Is this an attritional war which we can actually win? And it's those sorts of questions, I think, which will have to be asked. But we're not there yet. The Russians are advancing at high cost. But of all the research I've done and monitoring of this throughout the entire war, the Russians are showing every ability to withstand those costs in terms of personnel and in terms of financial costs. So those are challenges that the Ukrainians face. I think that's broadly why much of the decision making around, for example, the use of Russian frozen assets to fund Ukraine for the coming years is going to be a crucial one to watch in terms of Ukraine's ability to meet Russia's attritional advantages. If it does have access to those funds in 2026, for example, that becomes a much more viable strategy for Ukraine to keep them in the fight. But of course, there are other issues, personnel, weapons, arms sales, etc., which we've discussed. So very complex situation, to say the least.
Absolutely, Alex. And that's certainly something that I hope that we can get you back to break down further. But my final question for you is, looking further afield, outside of the direct events on the battlefield, obviously militaries have to be resupplied to be supported externally. And from both sides, we've seen some interesting shifts, be that the development of the idea of Eastern Sentinel or NATO boosting its eastern flank after Russia's provocations in the north or with the drones. But on the other side, Trump's secondary sanctions seemingly making China get cold feet, and Russia's reliance on Russia and India for buying their oil or acquiring equipment from North Korea. What would you emphasize to viewers and listeners on this angle as our final thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the external factors are really important in terms of the dynamics of the war, and something I look at frequently. So you're absolutely right to raise the secondary sanctions and the tariffs. That, of course, has been is a result of the slight pivot of the Trump administration's policy this year towards a more hardened stance towards the Kremlin, broadly driven, I think, by growing frustration at the lack of any movement in the Kremlin's demands and ultimate war objectives in Ukraine, which, again, as I said, are unlikely to facilitate a rapid end to the war. So that slight pivot, I think, is designed to begin hardening some pressure on the Kremlin. The goals, of course, are to hit Russia in terms of its hydrocarbon revenues, which have historically been a significant chunk of the state budget. And it has to be said, that will have an impact, of course. Whether it will have sufficient impact to force the Kremlin to end the war in a timely fashion, again, I'm very skeptical. Up until now, let's just take stock, really. Sanctions have been in place for well over 10 years now, since the initial annexation of Crimea, and which, of course, increased significantly after the full-scale invasion. They have not influenced Kremlin decision-making significantly in any way, in my assessment. And there is a limitation in terms of what sanctions alone can achieve. But of course, this will have an impact on the Kremlin's overall benefit-risk calculus, particularly in the medium to longer term, in terms of the viability of continuing this war. I think at the point at which, if indeed, Russia's advances stop, those sorts of economic arguments, I think, will begin to have a greater impact on decision makers in the Kremlin, because for as long as the Russians can advance, they have somewhat a return on investment in terms of what they can show not only the Russian people but crucially President Putin. And ultimately, he is the final decision maker in Russia. There are, of course, influences around that. But when one looks at the other external factors that are influencing Russia and Ukraine, China has become an increasingly vital indirect supporter of the war. The massive expansion in exports for dual-use technologies, for example, to facilitate Russia's war indicates this. And that partnership has grown exponentially in the last couple of years, despite Beijing's protestations that it is a neutral party in this conflict. So that, of course, will continue to be extraordinarily important. The North Koreans also a very, very important partner to Russia, not only in terms of ammunition, which we've seen, and supply of ballistic missiles, but also soldiers that helped retake Kursk Oblast earlier this year, and increasingly workers. And we're starting to see reports. The Ukrainian military intelligence just a couple of days ago at time of recording reported that some 12,000 North Korean workers may well be deployed to Russia's largest drone production facility. So again, the Russians aren't immune to their own demographic issues and personnel shortages, but they have potential ally there that can start to offset those slightly. It's not a clear solution to all of these problems, but this is something that Russia's partners can facilitate. In terms of Ukraine and its own reliance on Western support, that's unlikely to go away. But the Ukrainians have, it has to be said, made efforts to steadily wean itself off over reliance on the West for certain capabilities. As I mentioned, in terms of drones, the Ukrainians are more than self-sufficient. In fact, they are looking to begin exporting drones. They are the largest producer of drones in the world, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. So self-sufficiency is there in that regard. The Ukrainians are also developing their own long-range, cruise missiles. The Flamingo missile, for example, which is being fired into Crimea and into de jure Russian territory as well, means that the discussions around the Tomahawks and such like this that keep going back and forth, the Ukrainians, meanwhile, have been cracking on and producing their own domestic nascent capabilities, which will have an influence on this war. They aren't going to be a war-winning weapon. I think no single weapon is a war winner. But, of course, it will have an impact, and it will begin to inflict increasing costs on the Russians, which previously the Ukrainians weren't really able to do. So there are still dynamics here that can, enable the Ukrainians to fight on their own 2 feet. But in terms of the macro picture, they are still reliant on Western funding, financials. The budget is still in a very difficult position. And I think that's why the discussions around the use of Russian frozen assets in 2026, like I said, will be an important one to watch. The Trump administration's policy, of course, does provide a certain amount of instability in terms of Ukraine's ability to economically and militarily plan for 2026. But, we're not really seeing any indication that the Trump administration is going to rapidly withdraw all arms sales to Ukraine. In fact, actually, we've seen a steady increase in the Trump administration's willingness to sell weapons to Ukraine and European NATO allies to fund that. So in 2026, we could well see that providing significant and important support to keep the Ukrainians in the fight. But of course, all of these dynamics are and will remain essentially, hostage really to diplomatic relationships. And, those are very difficult to predict. Diplomatic issues and, fallings out can and have had an impact on this war. So we can't rule those out to significantly shift the dial in a relatively rapid fashion. But at the moment, in terms of the wider picture, those are some of the dynamics in terms of external support, which I think will be particularly important to watch in the short to medium term.
Indeed, they will, Alex. It's quite a good emphasis, I think, on the frozen assets thing. Belgium being surprisingly obstructive to that, but also your start point about as long as the Russians can continue to advance, they have a return on investment, and indeed, that's I think a very apt summary. But Alexandre Lord, lead analyst at Sibylline on Russia and the Ukraine war. Thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to having you back soon, perhaps in 2026, to look forward to the future of that part and many more aspects to the war. But that's it from me, everyone. Take care. And if you like the video, give it a like, subscribe. We'll see you all next time. Take care.